Welcome to the Mo Problems podcast. Today we got a lot of interesting topics we're going to cover here. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Drop the like button. We're going to be talking about a lot of cool history stuff today. This is a podcast dedicated to history. Mostly ancient history. Mostly ancient Roman history. But we'll cover some other topics as well. We'll cover some American history, some different stuff. So let's get right into it. How you guys doing today? We're going to be talking about ancient Roman women. That's one of my favorite topics. Honestly, one of my favorite topics to read about. One of the things that I have a lot of primary sources on. I have a lot of great secondary source books. Ancient Roman women. To me, is a very, very underappreciated, talked about topic in history. I think just women's history in general, it's just not talked about as much. But, so specifically, I'll say this real quick. Interesting story real quick. The other day I was watching a podcast with a historian who's being interviewed about the history of the Praetorian Guard. And it was great. He's an Irish historian. I think if you probably Google Irish historian, Praetorian Guard, he'll probably come up. He's kind of like a skinny set guy, very Irish looking. I think he has brown hair. But at one point, he was talking about the different legal and social things that the Praetorians did, right? Because, they did a lot more than just fight in battles and lead men, right? They did a lot of different things. Being a Praetorian was a very, very busy job. So in this podcast, he said at one point, we have these letters. I think they're like one of those papyrus stashes that we have from North Africa. Because, in North Africa, we have so many different papyruses because of the climate. The desert preserves them, right? So it's one of those stashes that, I think we found at one of the forts there, similar to the Vindolandum fort in England, and all the letters and papyrus that we found there. So it's similar to that, the Vindolandum. But anyway, in one of the letters, one of the soldiers, I can't remember if he was like an NCO or an officer or like a private or whatever, he wrote a letter to his centurion asking his centurion if he would help him with a marital dispute he's having. He says in the note that his wife had left him, moved to a town that was like, I don't remember how many. I'm an American, so I don't do kilometers, but the Irish guy said kilometers. I don't remember how many kilometers or miles it was. I would guess probably, I think it was maybe like 50 or 60 miles away. So she moved to another Roman city, right? And he asks the Praetorian if he can get help getting her back because she moved in with another man. So basically, this Roman legionary soldier, his wife had left him, and he was writing to his Praetorian being like, hey, dude, can you help me out? My wife, she left me, And I think that's absolutely hilarious. That's so funny. But I think it highlights something about Roman women that is really interesting, right? And the kudos to the Irish historian for saying this, because he was talking about women in the Roman Empire at one point, and he said that one thing that shows is that Roman women did what they wanted. And I think that's true because, in certain societies, I'll give an example. Let's say medieval England, and look, I'm not a medieval England expert, so I might be wrong about this. But, in medieval England, women, were very, they had to listen to their husband. They didn't have as many freedoms, especially legal freedoms, right? So there's an example, medieval England, of a culture in which women, there's not a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of listening to what your husband and your dad wants and everything. But I think in ancient Rome, I've done a lot of research. I've looked at the laws, the economic status, all that stuff with women. And just like a lot of ancient women, they had a lot of social freedoms. They had a lot of power. especially rich Roman women. And I think there's so many sources that show us that ancient Rome was not a society in which men had a brutal dominance over women. Obviously men did in certain ways have dominance over women in the ancient world, in the ancient Roman world, of course, but not in the way, to the degree in which they were not free to do what they wanted. I've just read so many things about women in ancient Rome that I think most of the evidence that we have, the archaeological, the literary evidence, all of it, points to the idea that they were not, that they had the right to do what they want, And there's so many examples of Roman women, and again, these are what you would call middle class Romans, right? Leaving their husbands. I mean, there's so many. Here's another example of a Roman woman leaving her husband. There's an epitaph, or I can't remember what it is. I think it's an epitaph from a gravestone or some kind of archaeological thing. And on it, the man basically writes a story about how he married his slave and then freed his slave, and then the slave left him and married another man. And you just see that so much in both the archaeological, legal, and literary evidence that we have for ancient Rome, that women could easily, especially the wealthy ones, divorce their husbands. I imagine it was probably even easier, it seems like, for those who are middle class. Actually, I would maybe argue that it would be harder for the super rich ones to divorce their husbands because of politics, right, and money. But normal women, there's just so many examples of this, of them leaving their husbands. It's very, very interesting. And sorry, I'm gonna take a sip of water real quick. So, after I watched that on that podcast, it's funny how sometimes you'll watch something or read something and it just sparks something that you've done research on, and it just kind of re-sparked my interest in ancient Roman women. And so, one of the greatest women in history, in my opinion, is a Roman Greek woman, whatever you want to call her, named Anna Komnenos. However you say that Greek name, Anna Komnenos. So if you haven't read this book, go order it on Amazon right now. Penguin Classics has a great version of it that I have. I think I'm on page like 40 or 50 right now. It's called the Alexiad. So Anna Komnenos, her dad was the Roman emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor in the 12th century. So I think for about 30 years, starting in around the year 1100. And this was the last great century of Roman history. I mean, it's crazy to say that. I mean, it's crazy that, Roman history is so long that the 12th century was the last great Roman century. It's the last century they were super powerful before the Crusaders, of course, sacked Constantinople in 1200. The bastards they are. So her dad, he was a great emperor. His name was Alexios Komnenos, right? And he started the Komnenos dynasty that lasted for about 80 years, up until about 20 years before the Crusaders took Constantinople. And so, because of her dad's life and how important he was and how great of a general and emperor he was, she wrote a history of her dad's political career and his life, right? And it's called the Alexiad. It's amazing. I've only read like 40 or 50 pages. It's already one of my favorite historical primary sources I've ever read. One thing that's really important is to read primary sources, right? I think there's too much of an emphasis that we historians have on reading secondary sources, especially in YouTube videos. I mean, look, I watch Kings and Generals, shout out. I watch all these guys, but look, there's a big problem with those guys, okay? You can tell those guys, just like a lot of professional historians at universities, like they spend more time theorizing and debating ideas that have been created and perspectives that have been created by popular academic historians than like actually doing research and creating their own ideas. Because that's what you should be doing. Instead of reading secondary sources, that's a great place to start. If you're just getting into history and you want to learn more about history, okay, secondary sources are great. Start there. But then quickly move on to primary sources. That's the thing to do. You should be spending most of your historical reading on primary sources like the Alexiad. It's more useful to read the Alexiad than to read a book that some professor wrote about Alexios and about her and about Roman history at that time, referring to the Alexiad. It's better just to get straight to it, and that allows you to create your own ideas, add to your own theories, and add to your own cachet and collection of facts. Because that's the best thing about primary sources. History is basically you collecting facts. It's like a fucking Easter hunt. Excuse me, didn't mean to drop the F word there. History is like an Easter egg hunt, and you're just going to spend hours and hours and hours finding information. For example, one of the things I've gotten, useful information I've gotten from the Alexiad so far already, is the use of the term Roman. Okay, because there's all this historical propaganda. We instead of calling the Eastern Romans the Romans, because of medieval historians and politics and the medieval Catholic Church, we call them the Byzantines. Because we don't want to call them the Romans, because the medieval people wanted the Holy Romans to be called the Romans, when actually the Franks were more Romans than the Holy Romans, ironically. But we won't get into that right now. But so, you got to get straight into the primary sources so you can start collecting information and creating your own ideas instead of relying on the ideas of others. Because like kings and generals, and Invicta and those people, they're always relying on the research of others. Like Adrian Goldsworth. And it's like, look, I like some of these guys. I'm reading a book right now by that Greek guy who's a Roman historian, Cadelus, Anthony Cadelus, I think his name is. He wrote, the Byzantine Republic. Amazing book, by the way. Also by the Byzantine Republic. He's a great historian. I love his work. I think there are examples of historians that, it is worth looking at their research and making them a big deal. But I think a lot of these guys, like Adrian Goldsworth or whatever his name is, they're not. Like so many of these big and important historians, their research is just weak. Their research is weak. Their ideas are weak. Their ideas are not, pushing for great insight and ideas like this Cadelus guy. I love his research because it's interesting and groundbreaking, and he's making arguments that are fresh and new and that go against the grain. That's what we want in history. We don't want what Invicta and Kings and Generals does, which is just copy and paste what a million different guys have copy and pasted from the ideas of other historians. That is not what we need to do. We need to create our own ideas. And like Anthony Cadelus, I love the guy. Love him like a brother, okay? Because he creates, never met the guy. He creates his own ideas about history. He creates his own thoughts. And specifically, he pushes against all this Byzantine BS, all this, the Byzantines were Greeks, they weren't Romans. He pushes against narratives that are taught in schools, and that's what we should be doing. That really is. That's one of the most important things that we have to do as historians. We have to push against the false narratives that are created by academics, because there are. I have a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and I have a bachelor's degree in history. I should say that at the beginning of the podcast. I have a bachelor's degree in history, and I'm working on a master's degree in library science. And I love the humanities, and I love to study at school. But as someone who is in the humanities, I can tell you a big problem is that people are over-reliant on other people's work. Now, Adrian Goldsmith, I was just talking crap about him. But, I'm not saying his book should be boycotted. His book should be read, and it's okay research. It's not bad, but again, it shouldn't be glorified. We should be glorifying their ideas. you know, which is what is done, which is what's always been done with history. I mean, you know, the study of history goes back to ancient China, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, right? The idea of people like Herodotus and Livy and all these great works creating ideas of their history and passing it down. I know that has to be part of history, of course, right? It does. But we're taking it too far now, I think, and it's always taken too far. In the study of history, it from the very beginning, all the way back, whether it's ancient Chinese chroniclers or whoever, right? It's always been done like this. I'm gonna grab a sip of water real quick. 1 second. Anyway, we kind of tailed off there, but it just, this book, the Alexiad, it's just got me fired up about that because, again, it's like Eastern Roman history is so under-talked about. Primary sources are so under-talked about that this book is not a common read in academic institutions, universities, and with professors and stuff. It's just not. And with history nerds either. I think that, I guess let me put it this way. Your average academic historian and amateur historian, I think generally, can tell you more authors, right, than they can tell you primary source authors. They can tell you more names of dudes whose books they've read than of the books written by the primary source. Because, for example, should you spend your time reading Adrian Goldsworth, or should you spend that time reading the Alexiad? You should spend that time reading the Alexiad. Like, you have to get to the source. Like instead of glorifying, these academic writers that even I like these guys at Oxford and Yale and all these guys. As much as I like these guys, that's not what should be focused on. Like, Anna Komnenos is known less in the sphere of Roman studies than Adrian Goldsworth is, right? More people know who Adrian Goldsworth is than know who Anna Komnenos is. Anna Komnenos, an actual useful historian who wrote a history, 1,000 years ago. That's amazing. That's more important. That's more important than some dude in 2025 reading the same primary sources that we have access to and coming up with his own ideas and people becoming obsessed with that. And obviously, you should write your own books. That also brings me to another topic. Another very important. I know we're getting off here. I know this episode was supposed to be about ancient women. Oh my God. But we're tailing off here. We're going to do that a lot in this podcast. I'm not going to lie to you. We're going to be tailing off a lot. So the thing I want to tail off on here. The thing that I think is very important in the study of history is to just differentiate between a secondary source and a primary source. And I know that sounds very basic, but I just think it's something that has to be talked about more. Just knowing that what you're reading is not a primary source. Like Edward Gibbon. When you read Edward Gibbon, it's not a primary source. It's not. But anyway, these primary sources, they should be known more than the secondary sources are, right? And what it does is it undermines the primary sources, Like, and that's one thing that's bad about, like, Kings and Generals videos. And look, I watch hours of Kings and Generals videos, okay? I am obsessed. Let me tell you, I'm obsessed with Kings and Generals. It's bad. Okay? I'm addicted. So I want to act like I don't watch them, okay? But, like, I watch them to supplement primary source research that I'm doing. But I don't think that most people who are watching that video are doing that. I don't think your average Kings and Generals fan who watches a video about Alexios I, which, by the way, they made many amazing videos about Alexios I and the wars that he had reclaiming, parts of Anatolia and the war against Bohemond, all that bad ass stuff. But the problem is, I don't think your average King and Generals fan is reading the Alexiad while they're watching those videos. It's like they're not. It's like, but that should be the whole point, And I know it's not as interesting and it's more difficult, but it should be the main focus. Anyway, let's get to what I was going to talk about. So I've read about the first 40, 50 pages of this Alexiad book, and it's amazing. And it just, I think the Alexiad also is evidence for how, like, how important women were in the Roman Empire. I think the role and status of women in the Roman Empire is one of the most important things that kept, like, Rome society and war machine and everything going. I think there needs to be more research done on this. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, if you think about it, think about what this reflects on Roman society. That a woman was able to write a really popular histories that was passed down, in European tradition. It was so good that it was passed down all the way down to now, and it's one of the first examples of a woman publishing a major historical work. I'm pretty sure it's the first, at least in Western tradition. Maybe a Korean or Chinese woman did in Asia. I'm not 100% sure about that. But I know 100% it's the first the first history written by a woman in Western tradition. And okay, yeah, Anna was rich. She did come from the purple, all right? But still, it still shows you that women were respected and not put down in Roman culture. I really don't think they were. I think there are so many examples of the power and the importance of women in the Roman Empire, and I think this is just a great example of that. And this is one of the greatest primary sources I've ever read. A lot of primary sources can be very boring, very hard to read, very hard to understand. This is one of the, I'm like, I have to keep reading. When you start reading something and you have to keep reading it, you're like, well, I can't stop. I have to keep reading. That's how I feel about this book. I read a couple pages because it's written in narrative, right? And you can tell that Anna is obsessed with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the great ancient works, right? I would imagine she was also obsessed with the Latin works. I imagine she's a Roman, So it's amazing. Her writing is so good. She's a great writer, especially a great storytelling writer, and the narrative is so good and just pulls you in. It's amazing. Some writers are like that. Some other, histories you read or memoirs you read, they're not exciting. They're really not exciting. I'll give you an example of another exciting one. I love Louisiana history, LePage de Prats. If you haven't read him, read it. History of Louisiana, LePage de Prats. It'll be hard to put down. It's an amazing read. You're going to keep reading it. So here's a really cool thing that I've noticed. One thing that's just like why it's important to read primary sources. She keeps referring to her dad and herself as Romans. And this is important because obviously, to this day, there are some, although I think it is starting to go away, honestly. I think it's starting to go away and change. But, many Roman historians, they study Western Roman history and then they stop there and then it's Byzantine history, right? Like I study classics. When you study a classics program or you take a Latin class or whatever, right, the history of Rome stops when the Germans sacked the city in 430, which, by the way, Italy didn't stop being Roman until 750 AD, if you didn't know that. The whole 430 date is complete BS, but whatever. So she calls themselves Romans in the book, and that's important because that's direct evidence. So if I'm ever arguing somebody and they're like, oh, they're Byzantines, not Romans, I'm like, dude, they literally called themselves Romans. They were. They had Roman law. Many of them still spoke Latin. For example, Justinian was a Latin speaker. Now, at this time with Anna, no, none of them spoke Latin anymore. They spoke what would become modern Greek, what Greek people speak today. But that's very important. And those little details like that in primary sources are what is so important about reading primary sources. It's so important to focus and find those little things that you wouldn't even think of. And by the way, let me say this real quick. Calling them Byzantine makes no sense. Okay, first of all, Byzantium is what it was called in ancient Greece. The city wasn't even called Byzantium. That's what's weird. It's like, so the city was called Constantinople. So it literally makes zero sense to even call them Byzantines. There was no Byzantium. Constantinople was called Byzantium, obviously, in the classical Greek era, in the early Roman period. Julius Caesar times, it was called, them J. Caesar times, they were called Byzantium. Why would you call them that? You would think Edward Gibbon could have came up with something better than that BS. Like, wouldn't they be Constantinoplians? But of course that's why he called them Byzantians. I guarantee you he was like, well, we'll call them Constantinoplians. And then some other British guys were like, well, that's very mouthy, that's very wordy. I don't think we can call them Constantinopians. So he was like, all right, screw it. We'll call them, what were they? He was like, what were they originally called? Byzantium. He's like, oh, we'll call them Byzantines. Like, if the Romans, the Eastern Romans, if the Romans could see that now, they'd be like, Byzantines. It's like, I doubt most people, and by the 12th century in Anna Komnenos time, even remember that the city used to be called Byzantium. It was called Byzantium 1,000 years before Alexios I. Think about how long 1,000 years is. 1,000 years before Alexios I beat Bohemond and reconquered a bunch of Anatolia and just brought glory to the Roman Empire. They were called Byzantium. I wonder if Anna Komnenos probably knew because she was a nerd like I am. But I doubt your average Constantinopolitan. I would start saying that now. That's what I'm going to start calling the Eastern Romans. You know what? That's what we should start calling the Eastern Romans. They should be called the Constantinopolians. The history of the Constantinopolians. The history of Constantinople. Yeah, that's what it should be called. I would doubt your average Constantinopolitan in the 12th century knew that 1,000 years ago their city used to be called Byzantium. Like, come on, bro. Ain't no way. Ain't no way they know. But anyway, more podcasts to come. I'm going to talk more about the Alexia. I'm just getting started. We're going to get into it. There's just so many examples of just how powerful and important women were in the Roman Empire. I'll say this real quick. Most people don't know this. Ancient Roman women, had more legal power than women in the early modern period. It wasn't until the 19th century that European and Western women had the same amount of rights that ancient Roman women have. This is true. You can look it up. Susan Dixon, she's an Australian historian. And she says that in her book. She has a book called Reading Roman Women. Now, it might not have been her who said it. One of the historians I've read about ancient Roman women said this. It might have been her, it might have been somebody else. But she wrote a great book called Reading Roman Women, and the book is basically about the legal rights that they had. And restrictions, of course, that they had. But the rights that they had. And they had so many rights. I would argue, and look, I don't know that much about ancient Chinese history, so I might be wrong about this. But I would bet money that ancient Roman women had more rights than any other women in the world, any other ancient women. That is what I think. I think that to be true, and it's incredible. And it's just something that is never, ever, ever talked about in Roman history. Kings and generals, Invicta, all these guys, they never talk. And when they do talk about women, it's only about how women are put down. Ironically, you got so many important and powerful women throughout Roman history, and they're never talked about. What do you hear? It's always this and that about, they were subservient to their husbands and all this stuff. Psh, come on, bro. Was Anna Komnenos subservient to her husband? Psh, no way, dude. No way. Okay. Anyway, that's all I got for you guys today. All right. Sorry I couldn't talk longer. I think there's enough, honestly. I don't think anybody wants to hear me talk for more than 30 minutes. I think you guys would probably agree with that. But guys, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm going to be posting every week. Every week I'm going to be posting. There's going to be a new episode every, let's say, I haven't decided yet. Let's say every Thursday, like Bill Burr's podcast. He posts on Monday and Thursday. Every Thursday. Wait, is today Thursday? Today's Wednesday. So let's say Thursday or Friday, whatever. You guys will see. You'll find out. But anyway, thanks, guys. See you next time.